The rain in Seattle didn't just fall, it colonized. It claimed the glass panes of Mark's home office, blurring the manicured suburban lights of Willow Creek into a smear of charcoal and amber. Inside, the house was a triumph of modern architecture, all sharp angles, polished concrete, and open spaces that Mark, as a rising architect, had designed to be a sanctuary of transparency. How ironic that word felt now. Transparency. Mark sat at his mahogany desk, the blue light of his dual monitors reflecting in his glasses. It was 11:42 p.m. His back ached with the familiar strain of a deadline, but his eyes kept drifting to the third screen on his desk, the Lumina 9 baby monitor. It was a sleek, black puck of a device that cost more than his first car, promising unbreakable encryption and NASA-grade audio clarity. On the screen, the infrared view of the nursery was a study in shades of gray. He could see the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of 6-month-old Leo's chest. Leo was their miracle. 5 years of IVF, 3 miscarriages, and a mountain of debt had finally culminated in this tiny, breathing human. To Mark, Leo wasn't just a son, he was the glue that had repaired the fractures in his marriage to Elena. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the house. Mark didn't blink. The house was settling, or perhaps it was just the wind. Elena had gone to bed 3 hours ago, claiming a shattering migraine. She had looked pale, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy knot, her eyes avoiding the harsh kitchen lights. "Don't stay up too late, Mark," she'd whispered, kissing his cheek. Her skin had felt unnaturally cool. "You're working yourself to the bone for us. Let Leo and me sleep." He had watched her retreat up the stairs, feeling a surge of protective love. He was the provider. He was the guardian. He turned his attention back to the blueprints of the Vance luxury complex, but the silence of the house was too heavy. He reached out and tapped the volume icon on the baby monitor. He liked the white noise of the nursery, the soft hum of the HEPA filter, and the ghost of Leo's breath served as a tether to reality. At first, there was only the expected static, a soft, comforting shhhhhh like a distant ocean. Then, the frequency shifted. It wasn't a sudden burst. It started as a ripple in the audio, a rhythmic pulsing that didn't belong to the air purifier. Mark frowned, leaning closer. Digital monitors weren't supposed to pick up interference from cordless phones or CB radios anymore. They were unhackable. The pulsing sharpened into a hiss, and then, with the clarity of someone standing right behind him, a voice broke through. "Not much longer now. The signatures are the hardest part." Mark's hand froze on his mouse. The voice was low, masculine, and possessed a chillingly calm cadence. It wasn't coming from the nursery. Leo was still motionless in his crib, a gray ghost on the screen. The audio was a bleed-through, a glitch in the unbreakable encryption. "He's meticulous," a second voice replied. Mark's heart didn't just race, it stopped. The second voice was soft, melodic, and carried a familiar lilt. It was the voice that whispered "I love you" every morning. It was the voice that sang lullabies to Leo. It was Elena. But she wasn't in the nursery. And she wasn't in their bedroom, which was directly above his office. The acoustics of the monitor suggested she was somewhere cavernous, perhaps the basement or the garage. "Meticulous is just another word for predictable," Elena's voice continued. There was no trace of the shattering migraine now. Her tone was sharp, cold, and frighteningly efficient. "He thinks he's built a fortress. He doesn't realize he's just built us a vault." Mark felt a cold sweat break across his hairline. He told himself he was hallucinating. Sleep deprivation was a powerful drug. He looked at the monitor. Leo shifted in his sleep, tossing a small fist upward. The audio stayed locked on the conversation. "And the child?" the man asked. There was a pause. Mark heard the distinct click of a lighter, then a long exhale of smoke. Elena hated smoking. She banded within 50 feet of the house. "Leo is the perfect distraction," Elena said. There was a terrifying flatness to her words. Mark is so obsessed with being the hero father that he doesn't see the numbers shifting. He sees a family. I see an exit strategy. The man laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. You're a cold one, L. Even for me. How much is the Vance contract worth to the estate? Enough to make sure we never have to speak his name again, she replied. The trust fund is tied to the primary residence. Once the accident is staged, the insurance and the equity transfer automatically to the surviving guardian. It's all in the fine print he didn't read. Mark's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. His sanctuary of transparency was dissolving. He looked around his office, the expensive books, the framed degrees, the photos of him and Elena in Tuscany, and they all looked like stage props. When? The man asked. A month. Maybe less, Elena said. Her voice muffled slightly, as if she were moving away from the microphone. I need to get back. If he finishes that render and comes upstairs to check on me, I need to be asleep. He's so easy to manage when he's worried about me. The monitor erupted into a screech of digital feedback, a jagged wall of white noise that made Mark jump. When it cleared, the silence of the nursery returned. Leo was still asleep. The hum of the air purifier was the only sound. Mark sat in the darkness, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the desk. The red power light on the baby monitor stared at him like a cyclopean eye. He looked at the clock. 11:51 p.m. 9 minutes. In 9 minutes, his entire reality had been dismantled by a $300 piece of plastic and a glitch in the airwaves. He heard the faint, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of footsteps on the floor above him. Elena was back in their bedroom. She was sliding back under the covers. She was probably closing her eyes, preparing to play the role of the ailing, devoted wife when he finally climbed the stairs. Mark looked at the monitor screen. He looked at Leo, the perfect distraction. A wave of nausea hit him. He didn't know who the man was. He didn't know what accident they were planning. He didn't even know if the woman upstairs was the woman he had married 3 years ago. He reached out, his finger hovering over the talk button on the monitor, the feature designed to let parents soothe their babies from another room. He wanted to scream into it. He wanted to demand the truth. Instead, he did something else. With a trembling hand, Mark hit the record button on the Lumina 9's interface. Then, he turned off his office lights and sat in the pitch black, watching the gray, infrared ghost of his son, waiting for the static to speak again. The rain continued to hammer against the glass, but for the first time in his life, Mark realized the walls he had built weren't there to keep the world out. They were there to keep him trapped inside. The hunt had begun, and according to the baby monitor, he was the one with the target on his back. The silence that followed the digital screech was more deafening than the conversation itself. Mark sat frozen, his hand still hovering over the mouse, the cursor blinking over the save icon of the recording software. He had captured it. 6 minutes and 42 seconds of a life-shattering broadcast. He didn't move for a long time. The blue light of the monitors began to feel like a cold, clinical interrogation lamp. As an architect, Mark lived by the laws of structural integrity. If a foundation was cracked, the entire edifice was a liability. He had spent the last 3 years believing he was building a skyscraper of a life, a monument to resilience and love. Now, he looked down and saw that he was standing on a sinkhole. He looked at the baby monitor's video feed. Leo had settled back into a deep sleep, his thumb hovering near his mouth. Is he mine? The thought hit Mark like a physical blow to the stomach, leaving him breathless. The miracle of Leo's birth after years of failed IVF had been the cornerstone of his happiness. But if Elena was talking about miracle baby narratives and exit strategies, the very DNA of his family was now in question. With a trembling hand, Mark plugged a pair of noise-canceling headphones into his computer. He needed to hear it again. He needed to be sure he hadn't hallucinated the entire thing. He hit play. The static hissed, then Elena's voice cut through. "He's so easy to manage when he's worried about me." The coldness in her tone was what hurt the most. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the contempt. To her, Mark wasn't a partner, he was a project. A resource to be managed until the signatures were secured. Mark closed his eyes and tried to think. He was a man of logic. Why did the monitor pick that up? The Lumina 9 was an encrypted digital device. It shouldn't bleed into other frequencies. He turned the puck-shaped camera over in his mind. It had been a gift. Elena had brought it home 4 months ago, saying her old friend from college, a tech developer, had recommended it as the safest model on the market. Safest for whom? Mark whispered into the dark office. He began to dig. Not into his architectural blueprints, but into the digital architecture of his own life. He opened his private banking portal. On the surface, everything looked normal. The Vance complex payments were coming in, the mortgage was being paid. But then he looked at the automatic transfers tab. There was a recurring payment of $2,500 to an entity called Symmetry Property Holdings. It had been active for 18 months. Mark felt a pulse of heat in his neck. He didn't remember setting that up. He checked the authorization logs. The digital signature was his, but the IP address used to authorize the transfers didn't match his office or his phone. It originated from a VPN. The Symmetry account was a black hole. He followed the trail further, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a frantic, desperate energy. He found a secondary life insurance policy, one he didn't realize existed. It was a $2 million key person policy, naming Elena as the sole beneficiary, with a specific clause regarding accidental death in the home. The walls of the office felt like they were closing in. The accident they had discussed on the monitor wasn't a metaphor. It was a plan. Around 2 a.m., Mark finally forced himself to leave the office. He walked up the stairs, each creak of the wood sounding like a gunshot in the silent house. He paused outside the nursery. He wanted to go in, to hold Leo, to find some spark of himself in the boy's sleeping face. But he was terrified. If he looked at Leo and saw the stranger from the monitor, he didn't know if he could keep his composure. He continued to the master bedroom. The door was ajar. The room smelled of lavender and expensive night cream. Elena was curled on her side, the duvet pulled up to her chin. She looked peaceful. In the dim moonlight, she was still the beautiful woman he had married in a vineyard in Napa, the woman who had cried with him when the third pregnancy test came back negative. He climbed into bed, careful not to disturb her. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Mark." Her voice was a soft, sleep-heavy murmur. She didn't move, but he could feel her presence shifting. "Yeah," he managed to say. His throat felt like it was full of glass. "I just finished the render." "You work too hard, baby," she whispered, reaching out a hand to touch his arm. Her fingers were cool, just as they had been earlier. "Come here. You're shaking. Are you cold?" Mark stiffened. The touch that used to be his solace now felt like the coil of a snake. "Just a lot of caffeine," he lied. "Go back to sleep, Elle. How's your head?" "Better," she breathed. "Much better. I'll be 100% tomorrow. We can take Leo to the park." The park. The perfect family. Mark closed his eyes, pretending to drift off. He listened to her breathing, waiting for it to even out into the rhythm of deep sleep. He realized then that he was sleeping next to a stranger who had been documenting his movements, his finances, and his very life for an exit strategy. The next morning was a master class in psychological warfare. Elena was up at 7 a.m., glowing with health. She made organic French toast. She sang to Leo as she strapped him into his high chair. She was the picture of the devoted suburban mother. "You're quiet this morning," she said, sliding a plate in front of Mark. She tilted her head, her blue eyes searching his. "Did the Vance project go okay? You look gray." "Just thinking about the foundation," Mark said, staring at his coffee. "There's an issue with the soil stability. If we don't fix it now, the whole thing could collapse in a year or two." Elena paused, her spatula hovering over the pen. For a fraction of a second, her smile faltered. A shadow of something calculation, perhaps, crossed her face. "Well, you're the best, Mark. I'm sure you'll find a way to shore it up. You always do." She walked over and wrapped her arms around his neck from behind, leaning her cheek against his. To anyone looking through the kitchen window, they were the perfect couple. But Mark was looking at the reflection in the stainless steel toaster. He saw her eyes. They weren't looking at him with love. They were looking at the wall, cold and distant, as if she were already elsewhere. "I have to go into the city today," Mark said, pulling away gently. "I need to meet with the structural engineers. And I might stop by Dr. Thorne's office. I think we left Leo's updated immunization records there." The name Dr. Eris Thorne acted like a chemical trigger. Elena's posture didn't change, but her grip on the back of his chair tightened until her knuckles turned white. "Oh, I can do that, honey," she said quickly. "You're so busy with the complex. I'll call Eris and have him email them over." "It's no trouble," Mark insisted, standing up. "I'll be right by his clinic anyway." "Mark, really," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Eris he's very busy. He prefers I handle the paperwork. You know how he is about his special patients." Mark looked at her. Really looked at her. "Special? Right. Because of the miracle." He left before she could respond. Mark didn't go to the city. Instead, he drove to a parking lot 3 miles away, pulled out his laptop, and connected to his office computer remotely. He began searching for the name Eris Thorne outside of the medical directories. He found what he was looking for in a digitized society column from 10 years ago. A photo of a younger Elena, dressed in a black cocktail dress, laughing at a gallery opening. Standing next to her, his arm draped possessively around her waist, was a man with sharp features and a dry, knowing smile. The caption read, "Elena Vance and fiancé, Eris Thorne, celebrate the opening of the Thorne Fertility Institute." Fiancé. She had told Mark she had never been engaged. She had told him Thorne was just a highly recommended specialist she found through a Google search. Mark's stomach churned. The miracle wasn't a medical triumph, it was a long con. Thorne hadn't just helped them conceive, he had likely provided the biological material himself. Leo wasn't Mark's son. Leo was theirs. As the sun began to set, Mark returned home. He didn't go inside. He sat in his car in the driveway, watching the lights flicker on in the nursery. He took out his phone and opened the baby monitor app. The audio was clear. "He mentioned the foundation today," Elena's voice whispered. She sounded frantic now. "He's suspicious, Eris. I can feel it. He mentioned your name. He said he was going to the clinic." "Calm down," Thorne's voice replied through the speaker. "If he went to the clinic, he didn't get past the front desk. My staff is loyal. But we can't wait a month, Elle. If he starts auditing those symmetry accounts, we're done. What do we do?" "The accident happens tonight," Thorne said. "The storm is coming in. The roads will be slick. Or perhaps the faulty wiring in his office finally gives way. You said he's been spending all night in there." Elena stayed silent for a moment. Mark held his breath, waiting for a shred of humanity, a plea for his life. "The office," Elena finally said. Her voice was as cold as the Seattle rain. The space heaters. I'll make sure the ventilation is blocked. He'll fall asleep at his desk and never wake up from the fumes. It's cleaner than a car wreck. I'll be there in an hour to help you stage the scene, Thorne said. Make sure the monitor is off, Elle. We don't want any more glitches. I'll turn it off now, she said. The screen on Mark's phone went black. The no signal icon spun in a mocking circle. Mark looked up at the house. His sanctuary? His vault. He saw the silhouette of Elena in the nursery window, closing the curtains. She thought she was closing the book on him. He reached into his glove box and pulled out a small, heavy object, a spare key to the basement, and a digital recorder he'd bought at an electronics store on the way back. The marriage was destroyed. The foundation was gone. But as Mark stepped out of the car and into the shadows of his own home, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to be the one buried in the rubble. The rain had transitioned from a rhythmic drumming to a violent, cleansing downpour. Mark stood in the shadows of the detached garage, his lungs burning with the cold, damp air. He watched the house, his masterpiece, his pride, as if it were a foreign fortress occupied by an invading force. The glowing windows of the nursery upstairs were a cruel irony, a lighthouse guiding him toward a wreck. He didn't enter through the front door. He couldn't risk the chime of the smart lock echoing through the foyer. Instead, he moved toward the storm cellar entrance, a heavy steel door tucked behind a curtain of ivy. He slid the key in, the metal clicking with a precision that felt like a death knell. The basement was a labyrinth of shadows and the hum of the HVAC system. This was the gut of the house, the place where the pipes and wires, the veins and nerves were exposed. Mark leaned against a concrete pillar, his heart a frantic percussion against his ribs. He had to move fast. Thorne was coming. The accident was scheduled for tonight. He made his way to the storage area, a climate-controlled room where they kept their seasonal clothes and sentimental archives. He bypassed the boxes of Christmas ornaments and baby clothes, heading straight for the filing cabinet Elena kept locked. She had always told him it was for boring tax stuff and medical records that she preferred to manage herself to save him the stress. Mark pulled a small crowbar from his toolkit. With a sharp, metallic crack, the lock gave way. The first thing he found was a thick, manila folder labeled Project L. Inside was a chronological history of a lie. There were medical reports from the Thorne Fertility Institute, but they weren't the ones Mark had seen. These were the originals. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the technical jargon until they landed on the donor profile. Donor ID, at 092. Characteristics, 6 feet 2 inches, blue eyes, architect/developer background. Mark felt the air leave his chest. At Eris Thorne. The miracle hadn't been an act of God or science, it had been an act of biological vanity. Thorne hadn't just helped them, he had replaced Mark. Every time Mark had looked into Leo's blue eyes and felt a surge of fatherly pride, he had been looking at the man who was now plotting to kill him. But the rabbit hole went deeper. Underneath the medical records was a stack of financial statements for Symmetry Property Holdings. Mark spread the papers out on a dusty workbench. He followed the ink. It wasn't just $2,500 a month. Those were just the crumbs. The Symmetry account was a funnel. Over the last 2 years, Elena had been siphoning off the overages from Mark's architectural contracts. Small, 5-figure amounts that looked like material costs or subcontractor fees. Totaling it up in his head, Mark felt a dizzying wave of vertigo. She had diverted nearly $400,000 into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Then, he found the exit contract. It was a legal document, unsigned but fully drafted, for the sale of the Willow Creek house and the transfer of the Vance estate to a holding company controlled by Thorne. The date on the draft was for 2 weeks from today. The signatures are the hardest part, the voice on the monitor had said. Mark realized with a jolt of terror that the accident wasn't just to get the insurance. It was to ensure that his signature, his actual, living consent would never be needed again. With him dead, Elena would become the sole executor of the estate. She would sell the house to Thorne for pennies on the dollar, and they would vanish with the insurance money and the redirected funds. A heavy thud vibrated through the ceiling. A car had pulled into the driveway. Mark killed his flashlight. He moved to the small, rectangular window at the top of the basement wall. Through the rain-streaked glass, he saw the sleek, silver silhouette of an Audi SUV. A man stepped out, shielding himself with a large black umbrella. Dr. Eris Thorne. He didn't ring the bell. He walked straight to the front door, and it opened before he could even reach for the handle. Elena was there, silhouetted against the warm light of the hallway. From the basement, Mark couldn't see her face, but he saw the way she leaned into Thorne. It wasn't the tentative, migraine-suffering lean she gave Mark. It was hungry. Predatory. Mark retreated from the window. He needed to get to his office. He needed to see what they were doing. The house featured a sophisticated laundry chute that ran from the upper floors down to the basement, hidden behind a decorative wood panel. Mark had designed it for convenience. Now, it was his listening post. He climbed a service ladder and pressed his ear against the thin drywall of the chute. "Is the baby down?" Thorne's voice was muffled but clear. "Dead to the world," Elena replied. "I gave him a little extra of the nighttime formula. He won't wake up until tomorrow morning." Mark's blood turned to ice. She was drugging the child. Their child. And Mark. "He's not back yet," Elena said, her voice dripping with a casual malice that made Mark's skin crawl. "He called and said he was going to the clinic. He sounded off. I think he's finally putting pieces together, Eris. We can't wait for him to fall asleep naturally. We have to be ready the moment he walks through that door. The heaters are in the office." "Yes. 2 of them. I've already blocked the external vent and the gap under the door with weather stripping. I told him the room felt drafty earlier today. He didn't even blink when I suggested he use the space heaters tonight." "Good," Thorne said. "Once he's in there, we'll wait for the carbon monoxide levels to spike. I have the untraceable canisters in the car. We'll pump a little extra through the HVAC intake for that room. It'll look like a faulty heater combined with a blocked vent. A tragic, suburban accident. The overworked architect falls asleep at his desk and never wakes up." Mark felt a strange, cold calm wash over him. The shock had passed, replaced by a crystalline clarity. He was no longer the victim. He was the architect of his own survival. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He opened the Lumina 9 app. The monitor in the nursery was off, but the system had a secondary feature: the home security sync. Because Mark had designed the house as a smart home, he had access to the internal cameras he'd installed in the common areas, cameras Elena thought were disabled. He swiped through the feeds. He saw them in the kitchen. Thorne had his coat off. He was pouring 2 glasses of Mark's expensive scotch. Elena was leaning against the counter, watching him with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration. "To the future," Thorne said, raising his glass. "To the silence," Elena replied. They clinked glasses. Mark watched them on the small screen, his thumb hovering over the record button. He was capturing every word, every movement. But he knew that digital evidence could be tied up in court for years. He knew that with Thorne's influence and Elena's acting, they might still find a way to squirm out of a murder charge. He needed something more. He needed to catch them in the act of the accident. He looked around the basement. His eyes landed on the main electrical panel. A plan began to form in his mind, a structural redesign of the night's events. If they wanted a faulty house, he would give them one. Mark reached for the master breaker. He didn't flip it, not yet. He waited. He watched the screen as Elena and Thorne finished their drinks and began to move toward the stairs. They were heading for his office. They were going to set the trap. "Wait," Elena said on the monitor, stopping at the base of the stairs. "Did you hear that?" Thorne froze. "Hear what?" A click. From the basement. Mark held his breath. He was a shadow among shadows. He stood perfectly still, the crowbar heavy in his hand. "It's just the rain, Thorne said, dismissively. "The house is settling. Let's get the canisters. We need to finish this before he gets home." They moved out of the camera's frame. Mark didn't follow them up the stairs. Instead, he turned back to the filing cabinet. He grabbed the Project L folder and the symmetry documents, stuffing them into a waterproof bag. He then moved to the HVAC unit. He knew exactly where the intake for the office was. He knew how the air flowed through the house he had built. He reached into the unit and redirected the dampers. If they pumped gas into the intake now, it wouldn't go to the office. It would go to the master bedroom. But Mark wasn't a killer. Not like them. He just needed them to feel the walls closing in. He needed them to realize that the predictable man had rewritten the script. He climbed back up the service ladder, moving into the wall cavity behind the office. Through a small gap in the molding, he saw them. Thorne was kneeling by the desk, adjusting a portable heater. Elena was standing by the door, checking the seal. "It's perfect," she whispered. "He'll be dead within an hour of sitting down." Mark took out his phone. He didn't call the police. Not yet. He opened the house audio app, the system that controlled the built-in speakers in every room. He selected the office and the kitchen. He uploaded the audio file he had recorded the night before the conversation from the baby monitor. Then, he hit play. The house erupted. Elena's own voice, distorted and metallic, began to echo through the hallways. "Leo is the perfect distraction. Mark is so obsessed with being the hero father." In the office, Elena and Thorne bolted upright, their faces draining of color. They looked around the room, frantic, as the ghosts of their own betrayals filled the air. "What is that?" Elena shrieked. "Eris, what is that?" "Enough to make sure we never have to speak his name again." Mark stepped out of the shadows and onto the basement floor, his hand on the master breaker. He looked up at the ceiling, imagining their terror. The paper trail was secure. The confession was playing on a loop. He flipped the switch. The house plunged into total darkness. The music stopped. The only sound left was the roar of the rain and the panicked breathing of two people who realized, too late, that they were no longer the hunters. Mark walked toward the stairs, the crowbar dragging softly against the concrete. The darkness in the house was not absolute. It was a textured, heavy thing, illuminated periodically by the jagged white strobes of lightning that tore through the Seattle sky. In those brief flashes, the sleek, minimalist hallways of Mark's home looked like the ribs of a giant, dying beast. Mark climbed the basement stairs. Each step was a deliberate, calculated movement. He felt a strange, cold detachment. The man who had wept over baby photos and fretted over retirement accounts was gone. In his place was the architect, a man who understood loads, stresses, and the exact point at which a structure fails. He reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the kitchen. The air still smelled of the expensive scotch Thorne had poured. Two glasses sat on the island, glinting in the dark like twin obsidian totems. Mark didn't stop. He walked toward the dining room, his boots silent on the white oak floors. Upstairs, he heard them. The sound of a heavy object being thrown against a door. A muffled curse from Thorne. A sharp, panicked sob from Elena. They were trapped in the office. In his haste to seal the room for Mark's accident, Elena had ensured the weather stripping and the reinforced deadbolt features Mark had installed for security now worked against them. Mark reached the dining room table. He didn't turn on a flashlight. He didn't need to. He knew every inch of this space. He began to lay things out on the long, basalt top table. First, the manila folder, Project L. Second, the Symmetry Property Holdings ledger. Third, the Lumina 9 baby monitor, its red low battery light blinking like a dying heartbeat. Finally, he pulled out his phone and tapped a command into the smart home override. The emergency backup lights dim, amber LEDs recessed into the baseboards flickered to life. They didn't illuminate the room so much as they cast long, monstrous shadows upward. "Elena!" Mark called out. His voice wasn't a scream. It was a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate through the very studs of the house. "Eris. Dinner is served." The noise upstairs stopped instantly. A moment later, the sound of the office door clicking open echoed down the mezzanine. Mark had remotely disengaged the electronic lock. He heard their footsteps tentative, clicking frantically on the hardwood. They appeared at the top of the stairs. Thorne was in the lead, his silver-tipped umbrella gripped like a club, his expensive suit rumpled. Elena hovered behind him, her face a mask of pale terror, her blonde hair spilling over her shoulders in disarray. "Mark." Elena's voice was a trembling thread. She was trying for the distressed wife tone again, but it was cracked and hollow. "Mark, thank God. The power went out, there was this horrible noise on the speakers, we thought someone had broken in." "Keep coming, Elena," Mark said, sitting down at the head of the table. He gestured to the empty chairs. "You too, Doctor. We have much to discuss before the authorities arrive." Thorne straightened his posture, trying to reclaim his alpha male dominance. He looked down at Mark, a sneer curling his lip. "Authorities? Mark, you're having a breakdown. You've been working too hard. Elena was worried about you. I came over as a friend, a physician." "Sit down," Mark said. He didn't look up. He was staring at the Project L folder. Thorne hesitated, then descended the stairs, Elena clinging to his arm. They sat across from Mark, the basalt table a cold barrier between them. In the amber glow of the baseboard lights, they looked like ghosts at their own wake. "I've spent my life building things that are meant to last," Mark began, his voice calm, almost academic. "I thought this house was one of them. I thought this marriage was another. But you see, the thing about structural integrity is that you can't see the rot from the outside. You have to look at the blueprints." He slid the Project L folder across the table toward Thorne. "Donor at 092, Mark said. "A very high-end miracle, wouldn't you say, Eris? It's a shame you didn't disclose your biological interest in my son to the medical board. Or perhaps you were too busy planning the symmetry transfers." Thorne's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. He didn't touch the folder. "Mark, you don't understand the legalities of fertility." "I understand the legalities of fraud," Mark interrupted. He turned his gaze to Elena. She was staring at the baby monitor on the table. "And I understand the acoustics of this house, Elena. You should have checked the firmware on the Lumina 9. It has a developer mode that triggers whenever the encryption key is mimicked by an external device like the one Eris uses to bypass security systems." Elena's eyes darted to Thorne, then back to Mark. The mask was slipping now. The softness was gone, replaced by a jagged, cornered animal desperation. "It wasn't supposed to be like this, Mark. You were supposed to be the provider. But you're so boring. So predictable. You cared more about the Vance complex than you ever did about me. And so you decided to kill me for the equity." Mark asked, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was a cold, humorless expression. "A carbon monoxide accident in the office? It's a bit cliché for an architect, don't you think? I would have expected something more elegant from a woman of your taste." You have nothing, Thorne hissed, leaning forward. A few recordings. A folder? I have the best lawyers in the state. You're a man who's been hallucinating from stress. No one will believe a word you say. That's the beauty of a smart home, heiress, Mark said. He reached out and tapped a button on his phone. The wall behind them, a large, 80-inch recessed screen used for architectural presentations, flickered to life. It was powered by the house's independent Tesla Powerwall. On the screen, a high-definition video began to play. It was the kitchen, 30 minutes ago. The quality was crystal clear. It showed Thorne pouring the scotch. It showed Elena leaning into him. The accident happens tonight, Thorne's voice boomed through the dining room speakers, crisp and undeniable. The storm is coming in, the faulty wiring, it'll look like a tragic, suburban accident. The video cut to the office. It showed Thorne kneeling by the desk, adjusting the heaters, while Elena blocked the vents. It showed them conspiring, laughing, and toasting to the silence. I didn't just record the audio, heiress, Mark said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I have the telemetry. The HVAC sensors recorded the exact moment the dampers were manipulated. The smart lock logs show you entering without a key. And the cloud? The cloud has been streaming this to a private server for the last 3 hours. Elena let out a low, keening sound. She looked at the screen as if it were a portal to hell. Thorne, however, didn't break. He stood up, his hand reaching into his coat pocket. Cloud servers can be erased, Mark. And dead men can't testify to telemetry. He pulled out a heavy, snub-nosed revolver. Elena gasped, shrinking back. Heiress. No, you said. The plan changed, Elena. Thorne snapped, his eyes fixed on Mark. The accident is off. Now it's a home invasion. A distraught architect kills his wife and his specialist in a fit of rage, then turns the gun on himself. It's messy, but it works. Mark didn't flinch. He didn't even stand up. He just looked at the barrel of the gun, then back at Thorne. You're making a mistake, heiress, Mark said. You're thinking like a doctor. You should be thinking like an architect. And why is that? Thorne sneered, thumbing the hammer back. Because in this house, I control the environment, Mark said. He didn't tap his phone. He simply spoke to the air. System, Emergency Protocol Delta. The house reacted instantly. A high-pitched, agonizingly loud frequency erupted from the hidden speakers in the dining room, a sound designed to incapacitate through sheer sonic pressure. Thorne screamed, dropping the gun and clutching his ears as his balance vanished. Elena fell to the floor, retching from the sudden vertigo. At the same moment, the fire suppression system in the ceiling triggered. Not the water sprinklers, which would damage the electronics, but the gas suppression system Mark had installed for his server room and archives. A thick, white mist of FM200 gas flooded the room. It wasn't toxic, but it rapidly displaced the oxygen, making every breath feel like a struggle through wet wool. Mark, who had already slipped a small emergency respirator from under the table onto his face, stood up. He walked around the table. He picked up the snub-nosed revolver and tucked it into his waistband. He looked down at Thorne, who was writhing on the floor, gasping for air that felt increasingly thin. He looked at Elena, who was sobbing, her hands over her ears, her miracle life dissolving into mist and noise. Mark leaned down, his face inches from Elena's. Through the clear mask of the respirator, his eyes looked like those of an alien god. The dinner is over, Elena, he whispered, though she couldn't hear him over the sirens. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but it was joined by something else. The rhythmic, pulsing blue and red lights of Willow Creek's police department began to reflect off the wet pavement of the driveway. They had been watching the live stream for the last 20 minutes. Mark walked toward the front door. He didn't look back at the phantoms in his dining room. He had one more thing to do. He went to the nursery. The sonic pulse hadn't reached this room, he had specifically excluded Leo's zone from the protocol. He opened the door. The air was still and sweet. He walked to the crib and looked down at the boy who wasn't his. Leo was awake. He wasn't crying. He was looking up at the ceiling, his small hands reaching for the glow-in-the-dark stars Mark had spent 3 days meticulously placing. Mark reached down and picked him up. The boy felt heavy, warm, and real. He was the only real thing left in a house built on lies. "It's okay, Leo," Mark whispered, tucking the child's head into the crook of his neck. "The noise is going to stop now. The house is going to be quiet." He walked out of the nursery, past the mist-filled hallway where the shadows of Elena and Eris were being led away in handcuffs by men in tactical gear. He walked down the stairs, out the front door, and into the cold, honest rain. The architecture of his life had collapsed. But as he stood on the lawn, the blue lights of the police cars washing over him, Mark realized that sometimes, you have to tear a building down to its very foundations before you can see the sky. The morning after the world ends is surprisingly quiet. The Seattle rain had finally retreated, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum and air so crisp it felt like breathing glass. Mark sat on the tailgate of his SUV, parked at the end of the long, winding driveway of the Willow Creek house. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, bisecting the view of the minimalist masterpiece he had spent 3 years perfecting. To the neighbors, it was a tragedy. To the police, it was a crime scene. To Mark, it was just a hollow shell of glass and concrete, a tomb for a man who no longer existed. He held a paper cup of lukewarm black coffee, his knuckles still stained with the ink of a dozen police statements. Inside the house, forensic teams were still cataloging the accidental space heaters, the blocked vents, and the canisters of carbon monoxide Thorne had brought in his trunk. Detective Sarah Halloway walked down the driveway, her heavy boots crunching on the gravel. She stopped next to him, leaning against the vehicle. She didn't speak for a long time, respecting the heavy, suffocating silence that surrounded him. "We processed the offshore accounts," she finally said, her voice low. "You were right about the Symmetry holdings. It wasn't just your money, Mark. Thorne had been doing this for years. He targeted high-net-worth couples struggling with fertility. He provided the miracle, and Elena provided the access. They've done this twice before. 2 other accidental deaths in different states. You were just the latest project." Mark took a sip of the bitter coffee. "The latest project," he repeated. The words felt like lead in his mouth. "Was any of it real, Sarah? The 3 years? The late-night talks? The way she looked at me when Leo was born?" Halloway sighed, looking toward the house. "Some people don't have a reel, Mark. They have scripts. They have objectives. From what we gathered in the initial interviews, Elena didn't see you as a husband. She saw you as an appreciative audience for her best performance. And Thorne. He's talking. Trying to cut a deal to avoid the needle. He's blaming her, she's blaming him. It's a race to see who can betray the other faster. It's the only honest thing they've done since they met." Mark nodded slowly. He didn't feel the surge of triumph he expected. He just felt empty, a structural void where his heart used to be. 2 weeks later, Mark sat in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room at the King County Correctional Facility. He hadn't wanted to come, but the lawyer insisted he needed to serve the divorce and custody papers in person to finalize the abandonment clause of their prenuptial agreement. The heavy steel door opened, and Elena was let in. She wasn't the woman from the vineyard. She wasn't the glowing mother from the nursery. She was wearing a shapeless orange jumpsuit, her blonde hair dull and lank, her face stripped of the expensive creams and the practiced smiles. She sat down across from him, the plexiglass between them smeared with the fingerprints of 1,000 other broken lives. She didn't cry. She didn't plead for forgiveness. She just looked at him with a terrifying, vacant boredom. "You look tired, Mark," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the melodic lilt that had once been his favorite sound. "I'm here for the signatures, Elena," he said, sliding the legal documents into the transfer slot. "The house is sold. The accounts are frozen. The cemetery money has been recovered by the state as evidence." She glanced at the papers, then back at him. "You always were so obsessed with the paperwork. The foundations. The load-bearing walls. You never understood that the most interesting things happen in the dark spaces between the beams." "I understood enough," Mark replied. "I understood what I heard on the monitor." Elena let out a short, dry laugh. "That stupid monitor. Eris told me the encryption was perfect. I guess even NASA-grade tech can't account for a husband who spends his nights listening to the static." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Do you want to know the truth, Mark? Just once? Without the script? I don't think you know how to tell it. The truth is, I hated the house," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "It was too bright. Too open. You built a cage of glass and expected me to be a bird. Eris. Eris saw the predator in me. He gave me a purpose. You just gave me a mortgage. And Leo." Mark's voice trembled for the first time. "What was he? A prop? A biological weapon?" Elena's expression didn't soften. If anything, it turned colder. "He was a paycheck, Mark. A very loud, very demanding paycheck. He looks just like Eris, you know. Every time you kissed his forehead, you were kissing the man who wanted you dead. I used to find that hilarious." Mark felt a wave of nausea, but he didn't look away. He watched her pick up the pen and sign the papers with a jagged, careless flourish. She pushed them back through the slot. "There," she said, standing up as the guard approached. "You're free, Mark. You have your silence. I hope it's as loud as you wanted it to be." She walked away without looking back. Mark watched her go, realizing that the woman he had loved had never actually existed. She was a ghost he had invited into his bed, a phantom he had built a life around. The final blow came 3 days later in a white envelope from a private DNA lab. Mark sat in his new apartment, a small, 2-bedroom unit overlooking the Sound. It was filled with boxes, the only furniture a crib and a single armchair. Leo was napping in the next room, the soft huff-huff of his breathing coming through a new, basic audio monitor on the side table. No cameras. No smart features. Just sound. Mark stared at the envelope for an hour. He knew what it would say. He had seen the Project L files. He had seen the donor ID. He had heard Elena's parting shot in the prison. He tore it open. Probability of paternity, 0%. Mark let the paper fall to the floor. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The logical part of his brain, the architect, told him to walk away. The child was the physical manifestation of the lie. He was the paycheck. He was the evidence of the betrayal. To keep him was to keep a piece of Thorne and Elena in his life forever. The monitor on the table crackled. Leo had woken up. He wasn't crying, he was making that small, inquisitive cooing sound he made when he saw the morning light hitting the wall. Mark stood up, his legs feeling heavy. He walked into the small bedroom. Leo was lying on his back, kicking his legs, his bright blue eyes, Thorne's eyes, fixing on Mark the moment he entered the room. The boy smiled. It wasn't a scripted smile. It wasn't a tactical maneuver. It was the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child seeing the only person who had ever truly protected him. Mark reached down and lifted Leo out of the crib. He held him close, feeling the small heartbeat against his chest. He realized then that biology was just another type of blueprint, and blueprints could be redrawn. Elena and Thorne had created the house, but they hadn't created the home. "It's just us, Leo," Mark whispered into the boy's hair. "Just us and the silence." He walked to the window, looking out at the gray waters of the Sound. He thought about the baby monitor in the old house, the device that had destroyed his marriage but saved his life. It had stripped away the facade, leaving him with nothing but the truth. And the truth was, he was a father not by blood, but by choice. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer. "I want to start the formal adoption proceedings," Mark said, his voice firm and clear. "Regardless of the DNA. He's mine. He stays with me." As he hung up, he turned off the baby monitor on the nightstand. He didn't need to listen to the static anymore. He didn't need to wonder what was being said in the dark. For the first time in years, the silence in the room wasn't heavy with secrets. It was light. It was open. It was a foundation upon which he could finally, truly, begin to build. 6 months later, the Willow Creek house was demolished. The new owners didn't want the death house, so they leveled it to the ground. Mark didn't go to see it fall. He was too busy in his new studio, designing a small cottage on the coast, a house with thick walls, simple windows, and no smart overrides. He lived a quiet life. He was no longer the architect of the suburbs. He was just the man with the toddler at the local park. Sometimes, late at night, he would find himself staring at the old Lumina 9 monitor, which he kept in a box in the back of his closet. He never turned it on. He kept it as a reminder, a relic of the frequency that had shattered his world. He had learned that the most dangerous conversations aren't the ones held in whispers behind closed doors. They are the ones we have with ourselves, when we choose to ignore the static because we are too afraid of what the clarity might reveal. Mark sat on his porch, watching Leo play in the grass. The boy laughed, a sound that was entirely his own, untainted by the ghosts of his origin. Mark smiled, leaned back, and closed his eyes, finally at peace with the silence that followed the storm.